Okay, welcome everybody. Many thanks for joining us today on what is a rainy afternoon with me, but I hope brighter with some of you. We're very fortunate today to have with us at the CRCC seminar series Professor Cinzia Padovani, who's going to be talking to us today about Italy and the far right, I believe. So an excellent talk to be looking forward to. A couple of housekeeping points just before we begin. Cinzia is going to speak for around 30 to 40 minutes, after which there will be an opportunity for Q&A. We do welcome you with questions to come on screen, to share your video and to come off of mute and ask your questions face to face, more like we would in a normal seminar. But of course, if you would prefer to just pop something in the chat, I'll be monitoring that. So never fear, your questions will get seen. With that said, Cinzia has also said during her presentation, if you want to keep your video on, that would be great. And that way she feels she has some interaction and isn't just speaking to a screen. I think other than that, they're the main things to be going on with. So without eating into any more time, I will hand over to Cinzia to present.
Thank you so much. I wanted to thank everybody, first of all, Professor Ele Belfiore, Christian Baccani, Professor John Downey, of course, and the organizers for giving me this opportunity. So I will start right away. So in many parts of the world, the journalists tend to see themselves as playing an important role for the betterment of democracy. But what happens when journalists are faced with the question of whether to report and then how to report, and what is their roles when they are faced with ultra-right, anti-democratic actors? Well, this is a clear dilemma, because on one side, the journalists are supposed to report on everything, anything that might be of value, socially, culturally, politically, but on the other side, by reporting on it, they risk amplifying the significance of these actors and giving the oxygen, so-called oxygen of publicity, to actors who, if they were successful, then they could disrupt our democracies. So this is a quandary, which leads us to question the roles of journalism, of journalists vis-a-vis the ultra-right. In this presentation, which is also a paper, I develop a typology of journalists' roles based on a review of the extant literature bridging two fields, that of journalism studies and that of media and the ultra-right. And the empirical contribution is interviews with 23 professional journalists in Italy. The questions that animate, the basic questions that animate the research are: how do Italian journalists see their roles? Do they see their roles as a traditional monitorial role, as the world of journalism studies tells us that's the main, most important role, or still very important? Or do they see new roles emerging in this particular case when faced with ultra-right anti-democratic actors? We'll see the results of this study. This study also opens up an original, I hope, area of inquiry, the significance of which goes beyond the Italian case. The ultra-right is not just an Italian phenomenon, and we will see how that develops and the interactions of these organizations with other groups and internationally. So I am now going to move on to my presentation. I hope you can all see that, right? Okay. There you go. Okay, so an outline for the presentation. The context, I want to give you a context for the ultra-right in Italy, and then also their media, the media, and therefore self-representation of these organizations. Then we will go into journalism roles, that discussion and the ultra-right, and develop this typology, then go into the methodology and the interviews, and eventually do some observations and conclusions. So first of all, the context. As you can see here, this is my visual reproduction of the milieu, as political scientists talk about this, the ultra-right galaxy, these little groups, smaller, bigger. Some are small political parties, others are self-defined social movements. I'll point your attention to 3 or 4 of these groups. First of all, on top of your screen, you can see Casa Pound Italia, the turtle, which is a self-defined social movement, also self-defined in very self-aggrandizing terms, the fascists of the new millennium. They define themselves as social movements because they do take from progressive social movements some of their practices and some of their praxis, including in the ways in which they use their media, and also in the ways in which they squatter centers, occupy buildings, etc. Casa Pound Italia was established in 2003. It has copycats in other European countries. Look, for instance, Bastion Social, a social movement now shut down in France, and has a very close collaboration with their dear friends, the Golden Dawn. They too now in dear trouble. Below we see Forza Nuova, new force. New force should ring a bell with with those in the UK who study the ultra-right, because the founder of Forza Nuova and Secretary General at this point is, I think he's a British citizen, but certainly lived in the UK for many, many years, where he escaped. He escaped to London in 1980 after he allegedly participated in the Bologna bombing, part of the terrorist years of the 1970s. The Bologna bombing was in August of 1980. At the end of the day, Roberto Fiore was declared recently that he, he did not take active part in that, but he was very close to the neo-fascist activists of that time. When he was in London, he created an empire of Catholic charities, but also housing for international students, and became also very close friend with Nick Griffin of the British National Party, of course, that gone. Forza Nuova is also very active internationally. It created the Alliance for Peace and Freedom, a European political party. And in that Alliance for Peace and Freedom, Nick Griffin is the vice president, and there are many other groups, representatives of neo-fascist and neo-Nazi parts in various parts of Europe. Below Forza Nuova, we see Generazione Identitaria, the Italian chapter, the Greek lambda sign there, the Italian chapter of what was the offspring of the Bloc Identitaire. And in the UK, you also have Generation Identity, UK and Ireland. And then last but not least, the QAnons, Italy, who have, of course, they are linked to the QAnons in the USA, and becoming also quite visible. They came in the streets with Forza Nuova very recently in their no masker protest in the streets. Something about their media. Here I focus in particular on Casa Pound Italia, which is not your typical ultra-right group. They're very very aware of the importance of permeating the cultural sphere, of achieving some kind of, I don't mean hegemony, but certainly some kind of recognition in the cultural field. They go from traditional media, for instance, they have a very well-functioning and well-funded and doing very well book publishing, Alta Forte Edizione, which publishes books, novels, science fiction, narrative, comics, radio, web radio station called Radio Bandiera Nera, Il Primato Nazionale, that's very glossy weekly, monthly magazine that you can find at any newsstand, and then of course social media after they were banned on after they were banned by Facebook, they opened, of course, they migrated to Telegram, for instance. We can talk about all this if you are interested. This is just to give you a sense of the context. Now let's go into the study itself. And the research questions we already covered, so we're not going to go back there. How do journalists see their roles? Now, some of the literature in journalism studies, first of all, what are normative roles? In the worlds of journalism studies, for instance, they pay particular attention to role orientation, which are discursive constructions of the institutional values, attitudes, and beliefs regarding the position of journalism in society. I'm reading from the worlds of journalism. Normative roles refer to the ways journalists should serve a society. Traditionally, the role of journalism and journalists is very well couched within the tenets of the public sphere model. And although this model has been called into question, and I am very well aware of the literature of our colleagues Wall Jorgensen and Hanisch and Zelitzer, of course, first and foremost, that really criticized the centrality of the public sphere model in journalism, the importance of journalism for democracy remains central, and indeed that remains central in particular among journalists themselves. This is what the worlds of journalism also tells us. Then, as I told you, I was going to bridge the literature and journalism studies with the literature on journalism and the ultra-right. The literature here is much less expansive, but way more focused. And I refer in particular to the work of Barker-Merz, who has written on various occasions on how mainstream media, from a normative position, how mainstream media should cover the ultra-right or extreme right, as he calls it. In 2009, he advocated for a deplatforming position, not talking about them. More recently, in 2018, he reviews the various positions of mainstream media and says that highlights some roles that of accommodating ultra-right actors. When journalists treat these actors as any other actor, then we risk to accommodate these actors, or deriding and ostracizing these actors. None of them, says Barker-Merz, works. And so we need to, he advocates for the rebirth of the public service, public journalism, I should say public journalism movement and tradition, which developed in the 1980s and 1990s in the United States of America. And the idea is that journalists, he says, and I quote, public journalism encourages journalists to mobilize an ethical agenda and acknowledge that they are not mere dispassionate observers, but rather participants, active participants in public life. This seems to be particularly apt here, as journalists are engaged with reporting on with their roles vis-a-vis the ultra-right. So I developed this typology, as I told you at the very beginning, and the typology is taken from, as a way to summarize the literature, but also to expand on what are the possible roles that journalists could play, from the two opposite. On top, a favorable position, which, believe me or not, in a previous study that precedes this particular study, in which I analyze media text and the constructed coverage, the coverage from a discursive point of view of these organizations, shows some favorable coverage, to then at the bottom, the deplatforming or ostracizing position, and in the middle, monitorial, public journalism, and derisive. So this is my typology. The methodology of semi-structured interviews seems to be particularly apt. As we have said, roles are discursive constructions. So, interviewing journalists, having the time to talk to them about how they see their roles develop in this particular aspect seem to be the best, an apt methodology. This is a table that I created in which I put together all my respondents. The way in which I went through this, through getting my sample, has been through what I could call, referring to the literature, also a multi-start snowballing technique. I started by contacting some of my earlier contacts at the Italian Federation of National Press, but also within the public broadcasting RAI, a couple of contacts, but then also what I call social media snowballing, which is I started to follow a certain journalist, and then of course Twitter in particular would help me snowball and point out some colleagues, some other journalists who are in the field, and so that was very useful for me. And another way in which I created this list of possible potential journalists was from the earlier study in which I studied media texts and articles written on national press on the alt-right. I developed a list of those journalists who had authored those articles. So I had a pretty good idea of whom I wanted to talk to. And this is the list. As you can see, let's start from the from the right-hand side. Different political orientations. I really try to include, be as inclusive as possible, in that different media outlets, national newspapers, online-only newspapers, but also magazines, TV, channels, websites, and etc. The different positions of journalists are listed there. Some of them are freelance and younger, younger freelance, making 2 or 3 euros per piece, if you can believe that. Others are more established. Of course, we see an imbalance here of gender, and believe me, I had to really get into my sample to look for more female journalists. The gender and age imbalance, however, it reflects also the structural problems with the Italian news workforce, but we can talk more about that if you want. So let's go into the journalist roles and the analysis of the interviews. And in order to do that, I looked in particular at metaphor. And metaphors, as we know, journalists refer to themselves, use journalists a lot, metaphors a lot, right, to refer to their work. And after all, as we said at the very beginning, roles are discursive constructions There is a lot of figurative use of language. And I started to see that very clearly as I was going through the first interviews, that metaphors could be the way to organize my data. And so I organized the data. What emerged was these three roles: monitorial, public, and derisive, the central roles that I first indicated in the typology. One last thing I want to say is that as I go through the analysis of the interviews, I will also give you some examples. So the first one is the monitorial role. The words of journalism tells us that Italian journalists really find themselves in this role, and indeed, obviously they are there. Some journalists in this group were surprised that I've asked them what their role would be towards ultra-right actors. They are open to all actors. The journalist is a host and listens to all actors. Of course, you need to keep an eye to the balance of reality, told me a journalist for Corriere della Sera, one of the major news organs in the country, who has followed one of these organizations, Forza Nuova, since the very beginning, since the late 1990s. Because of course there is a tendency to go after this organization, this movement, when they are in the streets. But she said that we always need to keep an eye on the significance of what they are doing, and not overdo it, obviously. The observer, the one who never judges or deforms reality. One of the questions I asked during the interviews was whether the journalists would interview political actors on the ultra-right. Why did I ask that question? Because in the previous study of news coverage, I noticed a certain pattern of disturbing, I consider them, interviews with ultra-right political actors. And some of my respondents said that absolutely yes, they would interview political actors of the ultra-right, and I don't see anything wrong with that. I'm going to give you some examples of what comes from the earlier study of interviews. This is Corriere della Sera, so this is not a little news outlet out there. And these are just examples of interviews with these actors. These are political candidates that come from Forza Nuova, the new force party founded by Roberto Fiore. And as you can see, they are being treated, as Bart Camerz would say, they are being treated equally as others. As other political actors, they are given a photo op opportunity to smile and be normal. Also, the headlines here are very problematic. The first one on the left says, Forza Nuova aiuti al lavoro. We help labor workers. On the right, we see one of the candidates for Forza Nuova who is responding to accusations of violence, documented accusations of violence on the part of this movement against Roma citizens, for instance, in which she says, quotation quotes and headlines, "We are not the ones who foment violence." And in the center, there is this is an interview on Corriere della Sera in 2009, in which Roberto Fiore says, foreigners, we want it to stop. And in the interview, Roberto Fiore is given plenty of opportunity to explain that his movement is not against immigrants, but against illegal immigrants. And I'm sure you are very familiar with this kind of discourse. In these interviews, if you analyze them more in depth, I don't have the time to do that, we see a very neutral stance on the part of the journalist. The journalist asks a question, never goes back, never, and actually sometimes let the interviewee finish, have the last word. So that's a neutral, monitorial, I think, role. that might be problematic and might accommodate these actors. The other role that we talked about is the public journalist, and in this a beautiful metaphor, in my opinion, is the one of this journalist, actually one of the 2 or 3 female journalists, editor-in-chief of a news newspaper or magazine, in this particular case in Italy. She told me right away that the role of the journalist is that of a physician. And so fascism or neo-fascism or ultra-right in its ramifications, so moving away from a historical definition of fascism to fascism or neo-fascism that includes racism or misogyny or violence as political praxis, that's a society. And so the journalist, as a physician, has to use her work as a knife to take that cancer out. And also we need to let these underground forms of fascism or ultra-right emerge. That's the work of the journalist. Just a week before, for a couple of months, her magazine called Left, which doesn't mean the political left, it means something else, and we can go into that later on in questions and answers if you want, had just published 2 issues in which they take this issue right as the main topic. The first one says, how are we going to get rid of fascism? And the other one is specifically about freedom of speech, the debate about freedom of speech and social media, etc. And says here a very famous phrase, il fascismo non è un'opinione, è un crimine. Fascism is not an opinion, but it's a crime. So that's the journalist physician and some examples. Other metaphors in the interviews that I put together and put into this example, into this category, in this role, digs out what is concealed, sheds light. Another example of shedding light is the work, for instance, of journalist Paolo Berizzi, who has had these rubrics every day on the second most important news organ in Italy, La Repubblica, in which he talks about every day about an instance related to the extreme right or ultra-right, about hate speech and hate in general. So that's how, and he frames this as shedding light. By the way, Paolo Berizzi is under police protection because of the threats to his life coming from these actors who he has been studying for many, many years. Another journalist instead, but also very much under police protection himself. He's the youngest journalist in my sample. He talked about anti-fascism as being a value of the journalist. In other words, journalism, anti-fascism, he says to me, is not a political or a police position. It's not right or left. Is the position that is just ingrained, should be ingrained in Italy because of its constitution and its anti-fascist constitution. So, but he too, for his work, he has done quite some important work undercover, has written books and now many pieces for, this is the third most important news organ in Italy, La Stampa, has gone under police protection. The other role is the role of those journalists who deride or ridicule the ultra-right and these actors. Some of them told me, well, you know, this is a waste of time. This is an insignificant pursuit. the ultra-right, those are buffoons. They are caricatures. Right now, this is just a mise-en-scene. We have seen this. We have seen the buffoons, the character of the buffoons being used to identify, for instance, Benito Mussolini, but in recent Italian history also of Silvio Berlusconi, for instance. And this idea of fascismo pop is a kind of a cultural representation, but nothing to be concerned about. An example of this is the work that Filippo Ceccarelli has been doing. He's a very senior editor for La Repubblica, and this is how he writes about, for instance, Casa Pound, where he points out, the role of this very top model who has participated, and you can see her picture below, Nina Moric, who has participated in various manifestations of Casa Pound, and he uses those pop icons to emphasize his view of a pop sort of fascism. Okay, some discussion here. The different types, trying to summarize the data. We have seen nobody being favorable, openly favorable. Well, that's to be expected. But also nobody in favor of deplatforming or ostracizing the ultra-right. I think this is a different, there is a difference there with, for instance, positions in the UK, where I think there is more support for deplatforming or anti-fascist or anti-racist organizations like Hope No Hate, for instance, have advocated for this. Whereas we find monitorial, public, and derisive. The monitorial role, I'm going into some analysis, reflections here, observations, I would call them. Of course, this is not a statistical sample, so I cannot really devise any statistical conclusions. The monitorial role is the most heterogeneous in terms of political leanings of the journalists here. We find center, center-left, even center-right, in this monitorial role, much more homogeneous in terms of age, middle-aged and older. 8 out of 10 are men, but of course we have a very small female representation in the sample, so that's the monitorial role. The public journalist role, instead, we see that the gender composition is more balanced. 3 of the 5 women are in this role. The political orientation, however, is very homogeneous, all center-left journalists working for center-left organizations, and certainly younger, with positions more heterogeneous from the freelance to more established journalists. The derisive role is the most homogeneous of all in terms of demographics. They are all males and older, over 65. Political orientation is also homogeneous, right and right. Conclusions. So the dilemma, we talked about it at the very beginning, that this being a dilemma, the question of which roles journalists inhabit, and the related dilemmas, how to cover such actors, are complex, need to be studied in a variety of national contexts and across countries. This is a problem that journalists face within countries, but also internationally, as these ultra-right actors have acquired increasing visibility. So what roles journalists inhabit, and what similarities and differences that exist between this Italian journalistic experience and that of other countries? I believe that this typology can be portable and can be used to analyze other cases. And there you go, my reference for this presentation. And actually, I only took 32 minutes. Now, that is a record. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Cinzia. That was fascinating, and I'm sure we have some questions from the audience ready to go. So, if you do want to ask questions, please feel free to use the raise hand function. I see someone's done that already, or indeed to pop something in the chat. So we have a comment in the chat already. Splendid paper, thank you, and we have a hand up. So let me come to Saul if you want to kick off the questioning.
Sure. Thank you very much for that presentation. It was really, really interesting. I just wondered, as you did mention a few dialogue acts or particular ways of questioning associated with the monitorial role, whether there were other typical kind of dialogue acts that you've noticed associated with the various roles in your typology.
Thank you for that. That's very relevant. I asked journalists. What I reported was those who said that yes, we would interview even Benito Mussolini. If Benito Mussolini was here, we would say we want to talk to you. Maybe Benito Mussolini would not want to talk to them, but that seems to be a little historical nuance right there. With regard to the different, you call them dialogical acts or strategies of interviews, yes, different suggestions there. For instance, a few journalists that I classified I grouped in other roles, and in particular in the public journalism role, they would say that, well, nobody would support deplatforming. So you talk about these actors, but you never give them the microphone. You never interview them unless it is absolutely necessary. And in that case, though, you have to be very prepared with questions that are aimed at highlighting the ideological underpinnings of what they are telling you. For instance, in the interview with Roberto Fiore that I showed, there is a question in which the journalist, but this is so typical, says, what is your position about immigration? And Fiore says, well, we're not against illegal immigration, only, not against legal immigration, only legal immigration. And then he goes on and on in this interview, but also others, about the fact that there is a danger for white Europeans here, right? Now, that to a journalist who goes there with precise questions to ask, that journalist should counter act, right? And say, well, you know, that is the ground replacement theory that we have seen at the base of, of murderous acts. So there needs to be more. The journalist needs to be in control of the dialogic event there, rather than being detached and letting the person define themselves. Also, I found very concerning, but this is from my previous study, to notice that people, these political actors are represented, not in their historical positions for what they did, but rather in the context in which they are right now. So, for instance, given that the political context has shifted noticeably to the right, and what is considered center right now is even Fiore sometimes is considered a center-right politician. Well, maybe sometimes, we need to be more precise in identifying our interviewee. Now, one problem could be, as some of my respondents said, if we did that, they are not going to give us an interview. Well, they don't get an interview. But you know, this is yeah, certainly a very interesting question. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Sola and Cinzia. I wonder, Cinzia, could you end the screen share just so we can all see you in full for our next question?
How do I do that?
I think you have you should have an option for open share tray, and it should allow you to end your screen share. There we are. Thank you. That's perfect.
Sorry.
Not at all. No problem. So we have some more questions. So if we can come to Arianna next, I notice you have a hand up.
Yes, thank you very much, Cinzia. This was an absolutely fascinating paper. Splendid, really. I have a question about, you know, the further developments of this wonderful study. You said that you believe that the model can be applied also to other countries. I absolutely agree. But I was also thinking a little bit inwardly, because I've seen the list of the outputs you considered, and obviously the biggest national ones and absolutely thorough examples. But would you consider in the future also targeting some big but more local realities to provide a kind of map of the, I'm thinking, being Roman, I'm thinking of Il Messaggero, which has, you know, as you know more than anybody else, you know, several local ones, but I'm thinking that the Messaggero in Roma is a big local entity, and there are similar examples in other big cities. What do you think?
I think that is right on, Arianna. Actually, in an earlier investigation, you know, before setting up on this particular study, or the one prior to that, to this, in which I analyzed news reporting, in particular, I came across a lot of interesting articles on La Nazione, for instance. La Nazione, which is a very important news organization based in Florence, but then taking all, you know, part of central Italian region. Il Messaggero could be one of them. Il Centro could be another one. Also because at the level of local reporting, things might be appearing even more interesting. As you have seen with the British National Party, for instance, what really mattered was the local, you know, the local activism. So if we look at the national level, we might see very little moving, right? But if we go in the you know, at the local news, we might see more. We might see also journalists who are not as, maybe that's a presumption, not as well trained, not as ready to address this. Going off to your question, Arianna, for instance, when I did my exploratory work on La Nazione, I found a lot of that favorable reporting that then nobody would say we would do favorable, right? But if you think that Casa Pound Italia, or even Forza Nuova, or even Casa G in Florence, and other youth organizations, etc., do good things, they have soup kitchens, just like the British National Party is really a thing. So they do soup kitchens, or they go and bring food to the elderly. Well, if you focus on that and you have headlines after headlines on La Nazione about Casa Pound Italia opened their soup kitchens, Casa Pound Italia cleaned this statue, that monument, took care of the trash cans that were rotting in this particular street, then perhaps you might start depicting these actors at the local level as just any of our neighbor. So I think that's a very good point. I don't know who would publish something like that, though.
Thank you. It's a wonderful paper. Thank you.
Thank you, Arianna.
Thank you. We have, yes, a question from David, please.
Hi, David.
Ooh, you're still on mute there, David.
I had one thing to do and I got that. Yeah, anyway, thank you for a great paper. It got me thinking about how mainstream journalists, journalists of repute, deal with far-right actors. But it got me thinking about what about, how do these journalists and how do journalists respond to far-right discourses? Because it seems to me the far right isn't as far away as it used to be. We can see the mainstreaming of authoritarian populism in the US being articulated by the president. Indeed, we see sort of nativist discourses being articulated by the current Prime Minister in the UK. I just wondered, have you thought about, it's quite, how journalists deal with far-right discourses rather than demonstrably far-right, marginal, insurgent political actors?
Thank you, David, so much. Actually, this question clarifies for me some of the thoughts I have been having. I have been thinking about this, but not really systematizing this very much. But how mainstream journalists cover or deal with ultra-right or far-right discourse, that's even more to the point of mainstreaming the discourse rather than the actors. So that could be a next paper. It would be quite, I mean, some of the difficulty I found here was to have a clear focus that I could go after. So if you look at if we looked at mainstream discourse, we could look, for instance, at the discourse on immigration, or the discourse on what is very interesting, I think, is also the discourse on freedom of speech and social media in relationship with these organizations. So the discourse on freedom, it would be something that I would be interested to tackle as well. Yeah, thank you, David, very much.
Okay, we have a couple of questions in the chat for you, Cinzia, so maybe ones to note down, and then if we, William, I've seen your hand and we'll come to you after, but just not to miss this one in the chat here. This is from a colleague, Ayala. She says, thank you, Cinzia, for a fascinating talk. She's working on similar research in Israel and was wondering, one, have you seen any change over time in journalist perceptions? Two, have journalists referred to these actors' approaches to the media? I mean, if these politicians attack journalists, was that a factor in journalists' professional considerations when covering them? And then three, have you published your findings anywhere where I could cite them? Many thanks.
Oh, thank you so much. Well, excellent work, and please let's talk maybe then after this or on another occasion. Different positions over time. That's a great suggestion. No, I have not done a systematic analysis of changing over time. So I will take that on. The reaction of the professional class or the professional journalists to threats, also that I've seen it, and there is. We can go into many details. There are laws in Italy that unfortunately allow somebody like Roberto Fiore and other of these actors to sue journalists if they say he's a fascist. So there are journalists who have been, and these are frivolous lawsuits. But some of these people, actors, have a lot of money and they go after. So how the professional journalists respond to this, that would be great to follow up. And then lately, have I published? I have 3 papers under review. They have been under review for like 6 months. Is that possible, or it's just COVID? I don't know. But yeah, and once they come out, but I'll be happy to talk to you before that as well. We can share results. I would really like to hear from my colleague Bill Fremogo, who is connecting with us all the way from the US.
Absolutely. To you next, Bill. Oh, apologies there, Bill. You need to just unmute.
How's that?
Much better.
Okay, good. So Cinzia, great paper. Even though we've been colleagues a long time, I'm not sure I've ever told you about this experience that leads to my question. I was once in a newsroom. I was the deputy editorial editor at the St. Louis Post-Dispatch, where the editor was a person by the name of Cole Campbell, who was a leading light in the public journalism movement. So when I'm wondering whether or not when you use that term, you did make reference to the 1980s and 1990s in the United States, whether that's sort of the school of people you're talking about. And the reason I'll warn you in advance, the reason I asked that question is that I ended up being sort of like a main opponent of his within our newsroom because of maybe it seems like a fine distinction, but he had the view that, well, the newspaper should convene the community literally in the form of meetings, and should then lead that meetings sort of advance on City Hall to change policy. Whereas I was for the traditional kind of newspaper crusade that would still be aimed at changing policy, but wouldn't be like convening a meeting and here's the newspaper's meeting that's going to become another interest group to lobby City Hall. Am I clear?
Yeah. Yeah. So you are asking me, Bill, thank you so much for this, because in another occasion, I also got a question about this public journalism. So perhaps you are saying that what I am talking about in the case of Italy might not be reflective of this public journalism movement, right? Because
right.
Yeah, I can see how I need to revise that. As I said, I've got also another colleague who raised a question about that, because perhaps the practices are different. So how would you define somebody who says my position is to be anti-fascism is a value of my profession, and therefore when these actors come, I'm not going to treat them like anybody else. I will cover them, but I will cover them in a certain way, sort of a militant way, but I don't know if that's, yeah.
Yeah, no, it's a good, I understand your question. And so I would consider myself a person, even though I consider myself to be trying to be as sort of fair and balanced and objective as possible when I'm writing news stories, as opposed to, editorials. I feel sort of like you suggest that, you start with a certain set of values that are based upon the lessons of history, which are slavery is bad, democracy is good, fascism is bad. It's not like you have to re-argue those. Those are not things to be re-argued. Those are values those are starting point values. And I feel like journalists can have those starting point values based on the lessons of history without being, and still be writing as as balanced a piece as possible, still talking to the, talking to the Donald Trumps of the world, but then providing the context from history, So that's what I believe, and I do not consider myself a public, I'm a person who believed in the public journalism movement in the United States. In fact, that guy tried to fire me. Anyway, I mean, maybe it's a fine distinction, but to a lot of us who are in newsrooms and who maybe felt as though they suffered under this idea of the public journalism in the United States, that term has a particular meaning that's sort of set in that time.
Very interesting. Thank you so much, Bill. I'll follow up with you. I know where you
okay, yeah.
Thank you. So we have about 4 minutes left of the session, but we still have a fair few questions to go. So what I would say is this next series of answers may take us over 2 o'clock. If any participants do need to leave, of course, we understand. The session finishes at 2, so if you need to go, you can do so, of course. But if you want to stick around, and Cinzia, if you have some time to answer these additional questions, that would be wonderful.
We are on the red zone, a lockdown, so.
Okay. That said, then in the interest of fairness, I will give them to you in the order in which they were asked. So we have a question in the chat from Lewis here. He says, in the UK, we had one very successful example of a platform allowing challenge to a politician of the ultra-right, Nick Griffin's appearance on BBC Question Time, in which he debated other political actors, after which he was considered discredited and the party's rating fell. I remember it well. Despite this, there seems to be a move towards deplatforming in this country. Has your work considered examples where ultra-right journalists are given a media presence in their own words, perhaps either opinion or debate pieces in publications or appearances on broadcast media? And how effective or not is this at challenging these politicians by actually giving them a spotlight?
Is this also in the chat, right? Because I couldn't completely.
Sorry, I can just repeat the question element of that. Was just, has your work considered examples where ultra-right journalists are given a media presence in their own words? So opinion or debate pieces in publications or broadcast. And then the follow-up question was, how effective is this or not at challenging those politicians by actually giving them a spotlight?
Okay, so is the question about ultra-right journalists being on the spotlight or writing editorials?
I believe so, yes.
Yeah. We have some examples of journalists who work for, say, Casa Pound. They have a newsroom and they are very active in that sense. And also then go and jump fence and go into so-called mainstream journalism, like, for instance, La Verità, and Libero, but some of the mainstream far-right newspapers. I mean, how effective is that? Well, I think that goes into what Professor Deacon was mentioning with regard to the discourse, how certain discourse gets a more mainstream audience in that way, if I responded to this question. Nick Griffin, yes, perhaps we could say that the exposure that it got on the BBC Panorama was the beginning of the end. Deplatforming might work. I had people who, in other talks, were saying, well, deplatforming works very well. For instance, deplatforming on social media. It really robs these organizations of the potential of networking and becoming more visible, recruiting more people. So I think it depends on where we deplatform and where we shed light. But never, as one of the journalists told me, never ever stop shedding light. We always have to keep the lights on. I think that Nick Griffin is an example of that. But then we see Roberto Fiore, his close friend, enough light, he's still there. So, yeah.
Thank you. And we do have another question in the chat too, and I believe Anna Christine is still with us. So her question was, very interesting and stimulating research. Thank you. Do public journos associate their work with any notion of political engagement? Do they see themselves as engaged journos, or do they think that their physician role is how it should be?
I think that overall the public journalist engages also politically. For instance, the journalist who considers herself a physician, you know, I mean, her position and the position of the magazine that she directs is quite clearly on the left. But then we also have younger journalists, the youngest journalist who told me, I vote for Lega. Lega is Lega North, is a far-right populist party. I vote for Lega, but I hold anti-fascism as a civic position, as a civic value. Sort of what Bill was saying, you know, so ingrained in our history that we don't have to go back and debate that. That's clearly wrong. But then again, as Professor Deacon brought it up, you know, it's one thing to talk about the actors, and then another thing is to talk about the discourses. Because we might talk negatively about the actors, but then still engage those discourses in more sympathetic ways. So, yeah.
Wonderful, thank you. And I did note slightly earlier, Christian had his hand up, but I'm not sure if he's still with us. Christian, if you still are on the call and you want to contribute your question, please do so. Otherwise, I believe we just have some thank yous in the chat from this point on, Cinzia, for your talk today. As I say, brightened up a rainy Friday, and certainly lots of food for thought going forward for us.
Yes. Thanks very much. Let's keep in touch.
Thank you. Thanks very much. And anyone who's still in attendance, if you have additional questions for Cinzia, she's very kindly said, please do feel free to contact her by email. I believe that's easily findable by Google, but also we have a link to her Southern Illinois departmental page on our CRCC website, so you can find it there too.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, so it just remains for us to thank you again so very much for your time, for joining us, and all the best.
And thank you so much. Bye, bye. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Saul. Thank you, everybody.